And so you have to think in that terminology, in terms of what's going to catch people's attention at a majority level to create these necessary changes. That's how you need to think of it. Not this New Age crap. Get off my soapbox. So we have an understanding here now of Taurus in a way that maybe you didn't have before. Now, one other thing we want to say, because now we're going to go into the sexual dimensions of it and the anatomy and physiology. And one of the first things to know when you link it, i.e. the sexual dynamics of it all, to the procreational instinct, simultaneously combined with the archetype of self-reliance. This will then correlate on a sexual level to the sexual activity called masturbation.
No wise remarks, please.
Okay. Now, you know, this is only an issue we need to speak about because of certain kinds of religious conditioning. And here again, one of the greater values that any enlightened therapist or counselor or astrologer can do is simply to, as Carl Jung pointed out, to simply objectively validate the subjective reality of the client, not to lay things on them, as so many therapists do. And the point I'm making here, let's say, for example, you have a client in front of you, maybe it's a woman, she stands there with 4 or 5 planets in the second house, and maybe one of these happens to be Pluto. And you can clearly see, just by the emphasis in that pattern, that you have an incredibly highly sexed individual. And yet, let's say that this woman is born into a consensus state. Her degree of evolution is only at a consensus level. Let's say she's born into white Montreal, Quebec, and with heavy-duty Roman Catholic conditioning, which is now telling her that if she touches her own body, then something horrible is going to happen, isn't it? And all connected with hell and evil and guilt. And so, of course, now, because of conditioning, she's spent all these years repressing what we're observing here in the second house. And because of this repression, again, anything which repressed becomes distorted, and it becomes the basis of displaced rage, manifesting in specific sorts of behaviors. So now what if you, as the counselor, now using astrology, is dealing with this woman? Are you going to reinforce her conditioning? Or are you going to perhaps try to talk to her about why her soul chose to be born with that pattern? Because a deeper teaching in that pattern beyond a sexual application would be the obvious evolutionary lessons called learning how to be absolutely self-sustaining, self-reliant, a part of which is sexual self-sufficiency. And you're now presenting it to her this way. Can't you just imagine the possible relief that would exist in such a woman? Simply to feel validated? Do you understand my point?
If she had all that conditioning, how would you talk to her so she wouldn't be
Then I would look at her and say, fine, that's your choice. I'm not telling you what to do. It's your choice to do with this information what you wish. Your job is to present it, not to be attached to the outcome. That's one of the greater problems to most anybody working in counseling, is to be attached to the outcome. There are problems existing in their ego. I mean, if the person doesn't do what they feel they need to do, somehow they're a failure. another form of conditioning. You guys still with it? So we have this direct application sexually in this way called self-reliance, equaling masturbatory activity. And other sexual applications. See, one of the applications of this archetype sexualized is that you can now see that when you start conditioning that which is natural, it leads into so many inner blockages. Repression equals blockage. And in times like this, the way how it manifests through the second house, Taurus, inner side of Venus, it takes a high degree of what is called durational sex. Time-sustained sex, Taurus. Meaning, as longer the sex goes on, it's leading to an ever increasingly intense inner compression, which occurs through sustained sexuality, equaling increasingly deep levels of compression, like a coiled spring. Yes? Do you understand my point? Of itself, these archetypes they are not of themselves interested in too much what we can call sexual experimentation or variation. Taurus, sexualized, second house, is primarily orientated to what we can call meat and potatoes type sexuality. It's basic sex. Do you understand my point? Versus sexual experimentation. There's a high degree of sensuality at a physical level in the Taurus archetype, sexualized. It's truly orientated to touching, holding, sensual stimulation, which must be precursors prior to the actual act of sexual intercourse, meaning foreplay. This serves as a vehicle to create an initial warming, so to speak, of the body or the soul. Yes? Which allows for a progressive inner opening to the emotional body, and thus the physical body. Now, at its worst extreme, i.e., again, Venus implication, sexuality can become overly emphasized, disproportionate to the person's overall reality, meaning too much meaning is being projected into it. And at the worst level, just via the Scorpio polarity, would manifest as compulsive attraction to pornographic type sexual imagery. And at its worst, the Taurus person can then generate via this sexual imagery and the compulsive attraction to the person that they are now becoming sexual with. They will attempt, there's kind of an unconscious expectation / need to have that person conform to the inner sexual imagery in such a way that the person's now literally making love to the imagery versus the actual person. Do you understand my point here?
Yeah.
And this can be very horrible, by the way, for the person being sexual with this Taurian type. The reason being that this person all too often will think, man, this person must really love me. Look how sexually intense they are with me. The intensity is based on the conformity to the imagery. And once the person finds out they're not really the one being loved, so to speak, now you see this inconjunct manifestation. Crisis. Or, when this is the operational archetype, if the person that they're wanting to be sexual with does not want to conform to this imposed projected imagery, then what is going to happen is a progressive withdrawal, isolation from that partner. And it's now going to manifest its compulsive attraction elsewhere. This is sex at its worst. This is what we would call, what I would call, profane sexuality. And this is a direct extension of patriarchal conditioning, to where literally the other person has now become literally a sexual object, not a real person. How many of you would like to go through such an experience if you're that sexual partner? At some point, aren't you going to feel utterly, through the inconjunct, humiliated? Yes or no? So, see, what's interesting is that Taurus of itself has the capacity for natural monogamy. The key word is natural. But only if they feel they are the only meaning that their partner needs. That they're the one that makes the meaning for the person. If in fact they begin to feel that a partner is simply using them, literally using them, as a vicarious extension of sexual imagery, then that person's inner relationship to themselves, believe me, is going to suffer. If they stop conforming to this imagery, and this person now starts going out and looking for other, then even though this natural capacity for monogamy in Taurus would exist, they themselves would now look for another. Why? To recreate a sense of personal meaning in their own life. Do you understand my point? It can also be done for vindictive reasons. Scorpio polarity. Meaning, even if the person didn't feel like fucking someone else, they will go do it anyway, just to hurt that offending partner. This is how it can manifest through Taurus. Do you understand? At worst, of course, remembering these archetypes correlate with resources we're born with. All too often in patriarchal society, some women primarily, who have this archetype emphasized, some, will then use their bodies, sexually speaking, to make a living. And that's called prostitution. If you go to Italy, it's not uncommon for when you run it, no, I would not say common, but it does occur, when you see all the symbolism in a man's chart. In Italy, that will manifest as a gigolo. It's common in Italy, where the man's making quite a bit of money by having sex with the older woman. Common. That's why when you start doing birth charts, you better have a good understanding of other cultures. They don't operate the same. And see, that's one of the things you'll find out when you start doing this homework. Charts I'm giving you are from all over the world. So you better develop some understanding of other cultures. For example, how Venus and Capricorn in the 12th house in a Sicilian man's chart would manifest would be vastly different than a white Jewish male American. Just because of cultural conditioning. Let's take our little break. Maybe some questions that you want to ask, or you just want to carry on?
You said you were going to talk a little bit about masturbation. I wonder if you could, because I didn't hear you say much, if you could say a little more about masturbation.
What is there to say about it?
If, okay, let me phrase differently. In what way masturbation affects the sexual life of a person?
Each person is different, and we're just showing you that this particular combination of archetypes correlates with that specific phenomena, and that it's really, you know, by the sheer fact that we're all human beings, we all share the totality of human archetypes and dynamics. The only difference, really, in any of us, is that which is being emphasized in any given life. So obviously this kind of dynamic can be emphasized in certain people for very specific reasons. And when it is emphasized, the linkage, the larger linkage, is to the evolutionary lesson called self-reliance, self-empowerment, the form of which is a sort of activity. And when the person is in alignment with their own natural law and allows himself to behave accordingly, they're in a state of psychological stability. Taurus. If not, if it's being controlled or repressed for whatever reason, then you have the potential danger of Venus called extremity. Extreme behavior is linked with disassociated behavior based on something being repressed. I mean, an example of this, one of the connections to these archetypes is called vicariousness. Vicarious, to be a vicarious extension. Because, see, one of the manifestations of Taurus can be laziness, relative to that frog in the well. Thinks it already knows everything, thus lazy. And many people can, when these archetypes are emphasized, can have a lot of inertia or laziness that is preventing them from developing their own personal sense of meaning. And then they become vicarious extensions to someone else's reality, Venus. And when that becomes sexualized, you can not only see that in terms of a couple, i.e. one person just playing out the agenda of the other, but it can also manifest as vicarious sexuality. An example of this would be called the peeping Tom syndrome. Or another manifestation would be in the case of clown Rajneesh. How many remember this clown? Rajneesh, now called Ossia or whatever it is. He was the guy that had the community up in Oregon, from India.
And here in Laguna, too.
And in Laguna. In any case, he was really a spiritually dangerous man, and this man had a second house Pluto in Cancer. So what he would typically do, given the fact that he personally was impudent, he also had Mars in Capricorn, and he would have his female sannyasins / devotees masturbate in front of him for his own sexual enjoyment. That's called vicarious sex. But for him, in his own distortion, that equaled emotional, psychological stability. You see? That's why a lot of these, in quotes, male spiritual masters, give me a break. These clowns have to go do something in secret. I've lived a long time in monasteries, and a shocking fact is how many monks have to smoke cigarettes. You'd be shocked. Why? Because they're repressing something natural. How many times do we hear these horrible stories, you know, the Tibetan Lama or Rinpoche now caught sleeping with this one. And, you know, the Tibetan rationale, she needed this. That's what their rationale is always. To cover their own tracks. Or in the case of a Muktananda, where he's making love to his sannyasins at the end of his life. You know, the history's full of this stuff. The Christian priest raping the little boy. These are examples of displaced behavior based on repressing something natural. So anyway, we have this vicarious application of sexuality through these archetypes. And again, a form of vicarious sex is the worst level, a person being compulsively attracted to pornographic imagery and the magazines and the theaters and the films and videos that demonstrate this stuff. That's also a form of vicarious sexuality. You know, don't underestimate this thing called displaced behavior. When you combine Taurus and Scorpio through these archetypes sexualized, it can also correlate with sex as power, meaning sexual dominance. And so the real question becomes, is that really sex? It is not. It's called power. Using sex as the vehicle.
Is anal sex always a power issue?
No. Because the Taurus, these archetypes can have a introduction to that form of sexuality. And this is itself, by the way, rooted in natural law. From an objective view, ask yourself this question. Because there is a gland in the human body that all men and women share in common. And that's called the Kundalini gland. The Kundalini gland is, in astrology, Scorpio, Pluto, 8th house. And it does emit an actual physiological substance that for centuries was in fact called Kundalini, which in natural law is understood to be the biological basis of evolution from a physiological point of view. Now the question, the objective question, why is it that the source of all things has placed that Kundalini gland in both men and women on the inside of the last vertebra on the spine, meaning the anal canal? And why is it that this particular gland, by way of the linkage to the nervous system, is linked with what's called a rectal vagal nerves, which is part of the involuntary nervous system. It's this system, when ignited, it actually ignites Kundalini. Kundalini can be stimulated to ignite the system, vice versa. So the point is, why is this gland in the same place in men and women? Meaning equal. Equal. Why is it not located in the fingertip? Why not put it over here in the eye? Why not part of our nose duct? Why there? Believe me, the nerves and muscular system that this gland connects to, when set in motion, is in fact the biological basis of evolution, or what some call genius, the key being set in motion. Even if you go to patriarchal monasteries, a common practice in yoga is for the person to bang their bottom on the floor. This is to, in quotes, awaken Kundalini. So, the issue here is that when this system is set in motion, sexually speaking, it is set in motion through the penetration of the anal canal, which can be done in a variety of ways. And it's this system, and when you link it with sexuality, that produces the most intense physical, emotional, psychic sensations, now sexualized, that the system can possibly produce, which ignites Kundalini. Now, the experience which is ignited there is identical for the man and the woman. This is what they share in common. This knowledge was known throughout natural way of living. And in many places, there are certain people that still understand this. But when you pervert it through patriarchal conditioning, now you see why it's connected to social taboo, sexual taboo. And why, in reality, in patriarchal way of living, this area is considered, in quotes, dirty. In natural way of living, people understand this is actually one of the secrets to the physical health of the body. Because through polarity, Scorpio, 8th house, Pluto, correlate with the intestine, colon, the intestine, and the elimination tract, anal canal. And in all natural living, see in the West, because of your externalized God, people here, when they want to get clean, they take the shower or the bath, and they clean the outside body. But in natural living, and even in patriarchal religions in the East, where God is inside, people for thousands and thousands of years also took what are called inner showers, or inner baths, in which they would cleanse the colon, the intestine, on a daily basis. And they did this with a conscious intake of water through the anal canal. The point here on the physical level, by keeping your colon and intestine purified, you will tend to live a lot longer and much more healthy, because you're continuously eliminating toxins. When you don't do this, you progressively create fecal compaction, which generates progressively toxin, osmosis, into the red blood cell. And you're decreasing the health of your physical organism. So to answer your question about anal sex, big high-winded answer. So,
and that also having the emotional body.
and so don't you find it rather interesting here that this is the area that Goddess put gland and male-female, that they share in common. You see the incredible equality here.
We're all equal at the body.
The bottom line, yeah. So, and believe me, long ago there was, there's a thing called natural tantra and there's a thing called patriarchal tantra. And natural tantra, believe me, is vastly different. And the etymology of the word tantra simply means ritual. And when you link this with sexualization, it means sexual ritual, whose intention is to actualize inner divinity, to use sexuality as an intrinsically sacred vehicle, to dissolve the appearance of distinct form, which generates the illusion of separation, individuality. And by dissolving this appearance, we have returned to the source. That's the intent. So long ago, all kinds of rituals were realized and applied. They were aimed at this purpose, to ignite Kundalini. And in natural Tantra, there are very specific rituals to do so, which if I told you nowadays would shock your current conditioning. Believe me. No, I won't. Put on my sunglasses. So, no, so, any questions on this stuff? Now we'll get into the anatomy and physics, because see, this is the point. The extremity of Taurus at one level is profane sex, and the other level is intrinsic sacredness of sexuality. Remember the octave of Venus, Neptune. The intrinsic sacredness of sexuality. So we have this vast extreme. And the evolutionary equation through Taurus sexually is to go from one extreme to this extreme, as long as we're in the patriarchy. You understand now? I mean, the worst forms of this is that when Taurus is sexualized, they want to treat their partner literally as an extension of themselves, in which the person has no real inner identity. And if they try to assert it, it's being limited and controlled. It goes back to the frog in the well. Anything that it does not currently know, Scorpio polarity, it feels threatened. So it wants to resist, deny. It wants to be stubborn. It wants to make stiff arms. So, now on an anatomical and physiological level, keeping in mind Taurus is ruled by Venus, you have a direct connection on the chakra system level to the heart chakra. Heart. Which of course connects the entire issue of how we're relating to ourselves. That's how we relate to others. Can we love ourselves? Can we love another? What do we like? What we don't like? How this is set in motion, all kinds of psychological reactions within us. This chakra is through which human entity is liberated. Period. It is the midpoint of all the other chakras. And thus integrating the extremity in that natural symmetry. From an anatomical and physiological point of view, Venus has direct Taurus, second house, direct correlation to the white blood cells. White blood cells. It co-rules the adrenals with Mars, and the physiology called cortisone. And the female correlates with the levels of progesterone and estrogen via Mars. Thus, the adrenals are implicated. Venus has a direct correlation again to the psychology of hearing. There's a direct correlation to arteries, capillaries, veins. As an example, would you have varicose veins? This is a Venus issue. It is a co-rulership with the ovaries in a woman, with the moon. There's a direct correlation to what's called the receptor cells, which are located on the bone marrow. Receptor cells absorbing a variety of hormones, including growth hormones. For those receptor cells to operate correctly, in a female, she has to have the correct levels of estrogen. If the correct levels of estrogen are not in place, she will not have the ability to totally absorb a variety of hormones, including the growth hormone. Similarly, in a male, because men also have estrogen in them as part of the male sexual hormones combined with the testosterone, if there's some sort of problem in the male sexual hormones, there's simultaneously a problem in the receptor cells. We want to look into these issues. Venus has a direct correlation with the kidneys and the ducts within the kidneys through extension with the moon, the urinary tract. There's such a thing as an example called kidney headaches. And this is when the ducts within the kidneys become compressed for whatever reason. When they become compressed, this becomes a causative factor of deposit formation, which can become an initial cause for kidney stones. When the ducts are simply compressed, it's done allowing for a correct purification via uric acid within the body, and this will then manifest as a kidney headache. Meaning when you have a kidney headache, there's nothing you can take that will relieve it, other than purifying your kidneys. Directly correlates with the phenomena called touching, as a Taurus, Venus, inside of Venus issue, the phenomena of touch. This is why all too often when you find in birth charts, 2nd, 8th house emphasized, and or the nodal axis of Scorpio Taurus, these people will typically have an acute sensitivity to touch, based on prior violations of touch, which have typically become sexualized. When you typically touch them, if this is the issue, they will typically jump and or put on immediate armor that is defensive in nature.
What if you have a sensitivity to sound?
A
sensitivity to sound, where things are louder?
That's Venus.
Is Venus?
Hearing.
Libra or Taurus?
Connects to hearing.
Is it the Libra or Taurus side of Venus?
That's the Libra side.
Oh.
The inner side is how we listen to ourselves. A lot of people even block to themselves. If you got Venus in Capricorn, for many people, this can be hard for them to even tune into themselves. They're afraid of what they're hearing, so they block it. Repress. So, questions?
Who are the people who are touchers? People who like to touch.
Taurus.
Taurus like to touch and be touched.
Very, very sensual. That's how you begin to warm them up.
Oh, so great massages.
Right.
Yeah, I like
Okay. Why don't we go ahead and take our lunch break now and return at... Continue in our happy year. From this morning, material that you would like to ask about. Okay. This is
the Taurus archetype, the second house, S&M pathology, usually that's Scorpio and Taurus. Right?
no, the Astrology does not emanate.
What is that thing? I mean, the power. That's not.
Power?
I'm sorry, I'm not being clear. It's not. It's not.
No, we will initially manifest in the Virgo archetype. Sex as power is an issue, but it's not specifically S&M. Other questions? Okay. One thing to clarify in terms of Mars, Venus / Aries, because Mars and Aries, as said before, do correlate the beginning of a brand new evolutionary cycle, sexually speaking. And again, it's these archetypes are registering the desires from the soul. Of course, sexual desires, which manifest through objectively, which then means that whatever house and sign your Mars is in, aspects that it's making, correlate specific sexual desires you have in this life relative to your evolutionary necessities. Now, the difference between Mars and Venus, Mars, Aries, is energy, and these dynamics means man or woman to initiate sexual activity, to initiate, to go out and get something. Whereas Venus, the inner side of second house, coming to the center, this correlates with receiving energy, to initiate energy. It has its own needs, which can be sexualized and manifests as expectations of a receptive nature. Somebody come into my life and realize these things, versus Mars, which says go out and find somebody to actualize these things. Critical difference there. I remember when I had a woman client up in Seattle, and she had and one of her classic statements to me, because I was her quite some time, she would have these cycles, i.e. cardinal, in which about in her turn she would go on an initiatory coming out of Mars and Aries. See the difference there. And this is very different, say, in having Venus in Aries, and this is wanting a partner to help that person their nature, in general, or sexually. And unless that person has such a partner, then they're just experiencing attractions. Attractions representing various components. But because it's in Venus application, to us is unconscious expectation of these these people taking action as if they're somehow post that this person wants them somehow. You see my point? Which can then create if these people don't act. Fairly different issue. Aries and Venus. So we need to. Any questions on those points? Good. This assumes we're all. Okay. Gemini business. I'll probably only be able to go today till it's really hard last night. Pluto's transiting my sun as we speak. So exist in this sort of form. It was literally like I was in a movie house last night and showing a lot of stuff about our collective future. And anyway, I woke up really exhausted, really quite fragmented, so based on what I was being shown. And so I'd probably have to stop around 3 o'clock and then Mark and so I'll try and get through my thing here. Now, first of all, let's consider the archetypes that are type. Make sense. Follow course. So it's a mutable archetype. It's yang or masculine, and both is energy moving out from the center, which is going to mental restlessness in consciousness. Every time, anytime, and you will have basically restless consciousness. Why? Because it's the consciousness that has decided to maximum growth for itself in that specific life. So when you put all these archetypes together, we have yet again the purity get out from the center. What we have now, keeping in mind the phenomenal keeping in mind the consciousness, the dynamic within it, security. Different and mentally insecure to live within the context of a life purely phenomenal. Phenomenal means the world of appearance. This itself does not call itself a whiteboard. The human mind does. It's secure. It's a projection. Phenomenal objects. The essence of the name correlating with the function of the form of the object. Now, coming in, there is now this absolute need to get to phenomenal objects and to know as much about that form as the possibly thus a restless consciousness to just of itself wanting via the mutability, a diversity of life experiences. Each experience gaining to that person. Here again, the knowledge is still based on the original Aries archetype, the initiation of action leading to a reaction. In this case, for example, bringing it up to 1999 Earth, typical manifestation. Person has impulse to go buy a certain kind of book, a certain kind of information. This is make action, go out and buy that darn book. And then a reaction person is now reading, and because of that reaction to the initiated action, they're bringing in knowledge via the book. See how it's working. And the intent and the Mercury application is to create linear logical organization of phenomenal reality. And progressively, this connects to knowledge. So, one of the intrinsic problems here is that because of the combination of these archetypes, the archetype of itself, Gemini, is of itself not necessarily concerned with the simulation of knowledge. Is more invested or interested in the collection of information. That's why when you have Gemini emphasized, for those that may have it, classic manifestation, person going into bookstore, becoming attracted to the title of the book, that book home, maybe reading 2 pages or 3 at most, and thinking it's read the whole darn book. That's an example of desiring to collect information without a simulation. And that's why at its worst, the 3rd house, Gemini type, can seem cuckoo. Do you understand my point? Or what in American vernacular used to be called the motor mouth. Just talking to talk. How many have never run into that type? Did you enjoy your interaction? Or at some point you want to go smecko. Like me. Just shut up. I mean, it's mindless babble. Just babbling along.
I have a friend that just died was Gemini, and I knew him for a good 35 years, and I can never remember talking. And I dearly loved him.
Sure.
Because this is Gemini. But I listened to him endlessly, and he loved me. I never. So we loved to play chess with each other. And all the time, he wouldn't even shut up then.
Yeah. And you have a Taurus sun.
Yeah.
So what you did with your yes was tune out. That's what happened. That's why you have no memory.
Could be.
See that one of the connections to Gemini is it correlates with left brain. Short-term memory.
Yeah, okay.
So unless he was actually saying something you found relevant,
Yeah.
most of it's going to fly over your head.
Yeah, I didn't mind it though.
No.
Well, he could whip me playing chess.
Uh-huh.
And the fool died before I learned to beat him. I was catching up with him. That may be one of the reasons he died.
Spoken like a Taurus. I remember seeing this little 5-year-old Taurus boy one day, and he'd come over to visit with our kids, and he was walking around this with this little, kids pool, and he was walking around this pool in circles, and his little mantra, "The world revolves around me." I'm the point of gravity of all. It was cute, kid. In any case, correlate with course, as most of you have learned, this is the hemisphere brain that wants out of Gemini to give logical, sequential nature of the phenomenal. To extension, issue we can call opinions. It's a idea there can certainly be a difference about whatever versus his opinion. But all too often, the individual wants to think or feel that its opinion is in fact truth, which is exactly coming out of following that the genetic comes into consciousness, necessary actual and or philosophical confrontation / arguments, which reveal the difference between one of the problems because of the combination of polarity. Remember, part of a mutable cross, Pisces. We're in Pisces, that correlates to totality of truth. Sagittarius, even though it's invested and desiring, and intrinsic problems of this is to orientate only to a portion of the truth, and then to think that that portion is the total. This is why we have a square from Sag, opposition to Gemini, squares back to Virgo, etc. The intent of which, again, is to generate necessary disagreement. The intent of reveal because of those arguments, confrontations. The problem of Sagittarius, because of its own version of the truth, in this case, security defined by the existing idea. The portion of truth, which is now because it's often manifests in America will be a Billy Graham archetype. The need to convince and convert other peoples to your particular points of view in order to feel secure. This is in a past hour, and remembering that whatever your particular beliefs may be, determined of themselves, you are interpreting the reality. So if this is now used with the necessity of security, Sagittarius coming through Gemini, how these truly master sales people. Anything, as long as you, that is the key to. It's the proverbial selling of the bridge from this country's point of view. As the Sagittarian polarity comes through it.
Okay. In regard to sales.
Yes. And it can be quite convincing because attributes of Sagittarius is sincerity. Beliefs. It is presented also, which can be a capturing point for the listener. So, you know, sort of like older in this room, there used to be a great singer out of Holland, actually, a guy named he made that album. No, it's a great album. I'm going to date myself. You probably remember. Jerry Eggert. I know that there's no special way. We all have our own way. That's the metamorphosis of the Even Jesus taught, you know, Christian revisionism, that there are 7 natural paths to the truth. 7. The chakra system. It's what he called in his the 7, or the 7 candles. Even Jesus, 1. There are 7 natural ways which reflect the natural chakra system. Making sense? And let's try to remember, please, look at it from this point of view. He had a stellium in Pisces, guess what? In my house. This is why he had to teach in parables. Analogy. Anytime you try to describe the ultimate truth, you can speak. You certainly can't speak of it in linear terms.
Why sort of poetry is often sort of as connected with Pisces rather than with like Gemini as a writing form, poetry, because it tends to be non-linear.
I mean, if you have a lot of Pisces in 3rd house, does it manifest as poetry?
No, not like that. It's more like taking from what you said about how you can't. Well, I am implying in a way that when you write poetry, you somehow try to say something which is true and which can be difficult to like say in linear terms. So it's just a kind of
Yeah, sure. I mean, poetry is really the essence of parable, metaphors, analogy, and this would typically be a Piscean expression to the 3rd house. It's just like Jesus on. And see, this is when we get later into the school and we talk about planetary nodes, and you'll see how relevant it is. For example, what if you dealt with person X and they had, say, Capricorn on your 3rd house? You're not normally going to think of that person thinking through analogy, parable, in a poetical term. You're just not. Mm-hmm. But what if, for example, we happen to find a south node of Neptune in that 3rd house coming through the Capricorn cusp? And all of a sudden we're observing talking to me like that, but I see Capricorn on the 3rd, I don't see the node there because I haven't put it there. I'm confused. I put the node there, it makes sense to me. See my point? So.
I'm trying to understand the Sagittarian polarity coming through Gemini in the convince and convert. And what if Sagittarius is coming through Gemini, they're going to like take bits of different things and they're going to do their own synthesis and convert their own. For Sagittarius, or just pure Sagittarius, convince and convert would be more align yourself with an existing thought
It depends on again, the evolutionary condition of the specific individual that you're referring to. If in fact you're dealing with a person in a consensus state, they would simply, at best, be a total collection of current cultural cliches, which would more or less constitute their sense of knowledge, what they're communicating about, what they're thinking about, which would then be reinforced with that Sagittarian polarity, needing to convince and convert. If you're looking at a person in a individuated state, coming through that Gemini, very, very susceptible to the collective ideas of the avant-garde edge of that society, but nonetheless of the ideas of the avant-garde edge, not their own, which they now buy into, and through the Sagittarian polarity attempt to convince and convert, which is a way of justifying themselves. That's the underlying motive. If you're dealing with a spiritualized, they're still orientated to patriarchal thought form, well, you can now see what's being communicated and justified through the Sagittarian polarity. Well, this thought form's been on our planet now for 5,000 years, therefore. You see my point? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
One of the greatest things are, years ago when I lived down in Berkeley, or up in Berkeley, I'm in California. Forgot where it was. And because I used to sell these matches, and they were astrology ones, and I'd always have these little for each sign, and they were humorous ones, but the greatest one I saw of all the 12 was Gemini, and it says, a walking mass of contradictions. Which is just about right. And the problem here, because of mutability, is that they will attempt to justify whatever their specific behavior or desires are about relative to the moment. So we call the changing ethics problem. Situational ethics. Situational ethics. That's what I'm getting at. And this is when you make the inconjunct to Capricorn, and truth manifests as the obvious hypocrite.
Yes.
Walking mass of contradiction. Situational ethics. It's naturally linked with Libra and Aquarius, the triad. Indecision as such, Libra. Wrong choice. But then when you bring that through Gemini, competing thoughts. Now there's also connection in third house, because the next house in front of it is number 4 house, Cancer. Third house has a direct application to our initial conditioning in life, i.e. through family of origin, which in most cases has. We also have to look at early life. Third house, there, location of its planetary ruler, its own house and sign, the aspects it's made. We find Gemini and the natal chart, and of course the planet Mercury, aspects it's making, and in totality, this will with a lot of the types of ideas that imprint the child, a lot of the ideas that correlate to their early environmental experience with potential siblings, and how many of these ideas are simply played back through siblings based on what they're from the parents. Do you understand that critical link? So we have a lot of interaction demonstrated here in the early environment that can also connect to siblings. And see, there are many, many cases where siblings also become intimate, despite patriarchal taboos. And see, one of the secrets astrologically, because I've dealt with many that have become sexualized, and what we discovered all that observation, remembering that siblings as such is Gemini/Mercury. But when siblings become intimate, remembering our triad, then you're looking at the Libra application of Gemini, Venus, when it becomes intimate. My point there. So when you're looking at this phenomena, and you're dealing with it at a client level, you want to examine then at that point the nature of the Venus in those two people's charts and the relationship it has to Mercury to find out why this is occurring. Yes? Especially when that sexual is consensual. Not one sibling trying to make it happen. See what I'm getting at? And again, where this comes from goes all the way back to the origin of species. For most of our history, there was non-nuclear family. Often brothers and sisters didn't know they were brothers and sisters. Do you see what I'm getting at? So, it happens much more than the society wants to admit. I'll put it that way. When you're dealing with types, one of the things you want to impress on is to really think more deeply about the very nature of whatever their current thoughts may be. The problem again is linked with the impulse to just collect information, which is why you have one of the direct applications that most of you have read in the Happy called being superficial, superficiality. And this is one of the reasons you want to encourage them to think more deeply. Yes? One of the problems of Gemini when it interfaces with this environment is to set in motion a reactive process, which is very different than a responsive behavior. A response is a considered reaction is just that, mindless, instinctual. This is when you find Gemini communicating and it can't even let the other person complete its sentence. Is that really a person now in a listening mode? They're more in the mode of trying to impress, meaning convince and convert. So we get in this horrible reactive process in which the two people aren't even allowing one another to complete their sentences. So at this point, they're virtually talking past one another. How many have never experienced this kind of conversation? Have you found yourself enjoying it?
I have on occasion. I had a guy I worked with that would always talk he ever heard. So I started lying like crazy, telling these stories of things I had done that were impossible, and he topped every one. And you could tell when he was listening to you, he was thinking about what he was going to say. dreaming up the next fabrication.
Right. Acting.
Yeah.
So this is one of the things you can bring to the Gemini type, is learning how to inwardly slow down. See, Gemini, as they get older, because of the linkage to Aquarius, has much more susceptibility for the phenomena called strokes or brain seizures, because there's such a conflicting mass, the mental energy. It's sort of like putting 5,000 watts through a 5-watt light bulb. Some fry itself. The guy that you're talking about seemed fried at the time.
He was just a nervous ball of energy.
No.
And he couldn't hold the job more than about 6 or 8 months. He just got bored and moved on to the next thing.
Mhm.
Would that relate to arthritis? Because my friend was no connection. There was something.
Arthritis, the initial trigger of, is linked to the sign Capricorn.
To the what?
Sign Capricorn. Saturn in 10th house. What you really have in those cases is a key lack of very specific minerals, which, because of that lack, promote a progressive dehydration, what are called the synovial fluids, which are responsible for the integrity of the joint skeletal system. And when they reach a critical mass of lead, then you have inflammation.
If Gemini were linked with Saturn then, would Saturn put a cap on that talkativeness?
Ah, good question. It would really depend on the rest of the chart. You couldn't make one statement like that. Because in certain cases, the whole person's whole sense of authority, Saturn, will be based on impressing others with the nature of their knowledge. In other cases, the person could realize in another type, via Saturn, that they were so deficient in what they felt inwardly that they knew. This is set in motion entire, depending on the whole. That's why these darn books and at the end of our school have a bonfire out and put our marshmallows there, and
Gemini be linked with manic depressive.
I'm sorry.
Gemini can be linked with manic depression.
I would say yes, but I would qualify it as not emanating from their emotions. There can be a very deep difference between manic depression coming out of our emotional body versus being depression from our. The point being, what is the cause? From the point of view of Gemini, what would the cause? It'd have to start with something mental, would it not?
Well, manic depression is mental. Yeah.
That can also have an emotional cause. For example, take the emotion of grief. And then can alternate this with the emotion of joy. That's an emotion. Joy, grief. And when they reach levels of extremity, you have manic depression, now causing the emotional body. So this can be very different than what you feel, i.e. mental, only caused by thought. That can occur, but it's different than emotion. So, through Gemini, because of the reason for it, to show you the astrology, it's the Sagittarian polarity, which is Jupiter. And Jupiter, one of the manifestations is exaggeration, to exaggerate something. So when you bring this through the mental dynamic of all kinds of competing and revolving thoughts, which now can become exaggerated, meaning extreme, you then see the mental cause. But believe me, manic depression is not limited to just mental causes. You know, I've dealt with over too many clients in this life, maybe 20,000. I've dealt with too many manic depressives. Because in fact, most of them I've dealt with have had the emotional cause, not the mental cause. These are heavy-duty combinations of Cancer Capricorn types. When Capricorn Cancer is involved, you're implicating emotions, not thought. And the emotions then manifesting as thought. When you link this with Capricorn Cancer, that thought typically manifests, alternating between cycles of incredible states of mental grief, futility. What's the point? The entire mental feeling of being defeated. And when that becomes the cause, then this then becomes alternated with its opposite, i.e. through Capricorn trying to define a new direction or a new goal, a new place to go, which sends in motion a temporary sense of enthusiasm. Thus, you see the alternating of the extremes. But the cause in that case is emotional. Other questions on this stuff?
Nervous disorders with Gemini? Is there other nervous disorders with Gemini?
Into the anatomy and physiology, you'll find out exactly what, but that's true. And the other, before we other questions.
Is there any, what's the thing about the twins with Gemini?
Duality. We link this with the ultimate issue, which is natural law, the intrinsic truth that explains creation, the natural law, time, space, black, white. This is also why we ultimately have the symbol Pisces. I mean, look at the glyph. Mm-hmm. This is called unity and diversity, not unity and sameness. That's what the Republicans want.
So can that show up in the personality also as having sort of a split not split personality, but Gemini Sun, and he's like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr.
Well, that's because of all the competing. One of the attributes that could apply to this, it's common, to be fickle. Connected to the Libra acquiring the tribe. Implications of Libra is to be to put in a person's face whatever you think they want to see. Chameleon. When this comes back to my fickleness. Now when we do the anatomy and the physiology, we have a direct application to the nervous system in general, the motor nerves, combined with a direct application to the central nervous system, combined with to what's called the parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous systems, which are on each side of the spine. Linked with the moon, you have what's called the optic nerves. So in effect, various forms of the nervous system, including the motor nerves. You have a direct correlation to the short-term memory. You have a direct correlation to the left brain and the synapsal structure in combination with Uranus to the entire structure of the brain. From a dendrite point of view, and in synapsal structure point of view. Synapses are like, for those that know Europe, central train stations there, in which trains go out from everywhere. That's like a synapse. So direct applications in this business. In combination with Uranus, it correlates with the lining of the lungs. Directly applies to the atmosphere that we bring into ourselves, i.e. air. It can have a direct impact, physiologically speaking, what is called the dehydration function of physiology, i.e. when we're feeling too dehydrated, we need water. A drying up action.
Now you're still talking about Uranus now. Uranus.
Mercury in combination with Uranus. Of course, it connects the entire phenomena called thought, the nature of thought. On a chakra system level, directly connects to the throat chakra. The simplest way to look at it is that it's the messenger within the body. It's the body communicating to itself. When you get a cold, it manifests as a thought. I have a cold. Then you take it has, in combination with Sagittarius, a correlation to the overall coordination of the body. Coordination. Sexually, Gemini is the first archetype to correlate with the phenomena called bisexuality. Bisexuality. Duality. Now remember the connecting point here. Gemini is naturally square Pisces. And Pisces wants to dissolve all distinctions in order to arrive at essence, God. So as a result, when sexualized, it manifests as a duality of sexual desire, which can manifest as an active need to be bisexual. Obviously, Gemini is going to be very sexually curious, to investigate a diversity of ways of being sexual. They want to collect a lot of information about sex. All too often they enjoy talking about sex. It's just another form of collecting information. All too often this will be the type that's running around from bookstore to bookstore, trying to find this book on sex and that book on sex and this method and that technique and this thing to try in that new position. It's all part of life experience for them. For Gemini to be sexualized, for a Gemini to become sexually interested in you, it starts with a mental compatibility and a mental excitement, a mental sparking, in which you trigger their sense of about who you are. This can then also become sexualized. There is a tremendous attraction to a diversity of types. is the point. Each type representing yet more knowledge. And this can then also equal sexual fickleness. The very last thing that Gemini lends us, natural law, is any form of natural monogamy. It's just not going to happen. One of the problems this can correlate to, however, is in certain levels of evolution, a person can also attract, collect, whatever their current cultural, sexual cliches are about. For example, in the late 60s, the groovy new norm amongst the hippies was what in this country is called free love. The whole issue of menage a trois, diversity of partners, and of course Libra was transiting, Uranus was transiting Libra then. I mean, look at that. Uranus transiting Libra. But the problem with Gemini is if they attempt to live out whatever their current cultural cliches are, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually linked with their sexual truth. Vegetarian polarity. And what this means is they can get themselves into their own psychological trouble just by somehow the current cultural cliche. Oh, it's groovy to be a menage a trois type. Oh, I'll go try it, Gemini says. But what if that's not true? Do you see what they create? And so when you're talking with such a client, you want to really talk to them in these terms. Do you really feel it that you need for yourself versus doing it just because most people are doing it? See what I'm getting at?
Doesn't Gemini learn by discovery, though?
Hmm?
So by the nature of Gemini, though, it would learn by discovery, getting in action and then response to it. So would they really be aware what their sexual nature is?
Yes, because we've already come through Taurus. In the process of what is me and what is not. And the problem with Gemini, they feel socially secure. Most want to do what most are doing. Then they're groovy too. So they're not always... Now another problem because of the incredible application of Gemini. How to say it? It sort of creates like when they're being sexual, it's like they're being their own mental voyeur. It's like they're being, and it's almost like they're getting more sexual / mental titillation from the act of observing themselves. Sort of like saying, look, Ma, no hands. And they're observing themselves. But this kind of mental observation is not allowing for a total physical integration or engagement, which then can create a real kind of frustration. When this becomes the operational reality, all too often this type will then attempt to involve themselves with increasingly intense forms of sexuality in an effort to get the body totally engaged. You see my point? This can also be true of Aquarius, and it can also be true of Virgo, another Mercury-ruled sign. Aquarius is Uranus. So you see the problem is the mental dynamic, observation. So these types can be frustrated like that, is my point. Yes. But then you have to talk to them as to why this is happening. Why the observation? And the why of the observation equals self-knowledge because of the observation. So there's an evolutionary reason for it, is the point. And this is how you want to talk to them, so they don't try to put a round thing in a square thing. See my point?
Jeffrey, but there's a whole, this is an outer planet. There's like a billion of us. This Gemini.
What's an outer planet?
Uranus. Oh, did I jump in with that? Okay. Okay, but in Gemini, there's a whole zillion of us that have Uranus in Gemini. Mm-hmm.
That's true.
Some of them are retrograde. Be going against the norm.
And if you question every single one of that generation, when they're honest, they will tell you that there's an element to them observing themselves when they're being sexual. And they will, if you're honest, they will find some degree of, look, Ma, no. Especially when it's been a thought in their head for maybe a year or two and they find themselves doing it, you now see the mental excitement via the mental voyeurism.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
What do you almost say?
Well, that
I
wouldn't
think it's been
apply-
said.
Just because Uranus is in Gemini, that wouldn't apply to all of them sexually, though, unless they had Aquarius on the second, or, it aspected Venus or something. With their question of an outer planet in Gemini, wouldn't it have to be a planet that would somehow tie in with the sexuality of that particular person?
No, because all signs have sexual components. Any sign can be sexualized.
But everybody's got Gemini in their chart, so everybody has,
Unless it's being energized by a planet. In this case, a whole generation with Uranus and Gemini. The whole archetype's being actualized via Uranus. And because Gemini does, like any other sign, have its own dimension of sexuality, this is why that would apply to the entire generation. The only degree of difference being the degree of evolution. And how they are observing. The how will be determined by the actual. Let's say it was in the 7th house. Does it primarily come through the observations of the partner? I saw you doing the See?
Would that affect all the houses in the chart to varying degrees?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I'm curious how that ties in with the mythology of Mercury, because one thing I've been interested in is that Mercury is the only god, even Zeus couldn't go between heaven and Hades. Between Olympus and Hades, Mercury was the only one. But being the lower octave of Uranus, it's the lower version of Look Ma No Hand. If you're going into all the dark, the light places, would you say that Mercury?
To be honest with you, I'm not up on Western mythology, so I can't really speak to it.
Well, Mercury wasn't really a god. It was a messenger of the god.
Right.
Yes.
Most of which were incestuous. Clearly, you're dealing with the phenomena here of sexual boredom. And this means that, unless they're with a partner who is sexually as adaptable / mutable as themselves, it can be pretty hard for them to just want to be with that one partner. And this is where the Sagittarian polarity strikes yet again. Meaning, you have to remember the point of natural law, that is not yet genetically programmed in our genes. And so when this now becomes accentuated because of given the fact we're living in cultures that teach us that monogamy is the ultimate morality, all too often, of course, people who are having affairs are not now being honest with their existing partner. So we all can know without the complications that this can produce. So what is the teaching? That no matter what the consequences may be, honesty must be part of what Gemini learns at all costs. Because the teaching here is that honesty will always create the right reality, even if it hurts. Versus creating a reality which is based on an exaggeration or a lie or leaving things unsaid that should have been said. Once you set in motion a reality based on that dynamic, its only outcome is collapse. Just like taking the house built up and you would remove that card, it all collapses. You set in motion a reality based on a lie, it is destined to collapse. No matter how much you desperately try to maintain it.
For example, Venus being in Gemini, they would sense what the partner wants, Venus, and then Gemini energy would kick in, and they would say, with the hypocritical part of Gemini, oh, I can be what they want, and play that role. Because, Gemini being a yang sign, they go out to pursue the partner, having sensed what they want, to play that role.
Yes.
And be successful at it.
Right.
But at some point, like you said, everything built on a lie must collapse.
Right.
They will learn to resent that they're being somebody that they're not.
Right. This is exactly right.
Something that they once wanted.
Yes.
Which wasn't based on the true fact of their own nature.
Absolutely. Because one of the keys of the third house, Gemini, is mutability, adaptability. So you're quite right. They can play any role that is based on need. You're exactly right. Yes, sir.
I have Venus and Gemini, and I was going to answer from personal experience. Most of my life, I'd say up to the age of 50, I didn't care what the partner wanted. And I heard a lot of people. In recent years, I've completely reversed myself. And the sex act is totally to please the partner. Found out by trying to please the partner, I got the greatest enjoyment.
Well, see, this is part of the Libra Aquarius triad, because what you're describing now is the Venus application to Kant. And in Libra, our impulse is to give.
Right.
So via Venus, that creates a high degree with the energy manifesting from that partner. And by attuning / harmonizing with that need, then as you have discovered, this is the greatest way for you to be sexual.
Yeah. I wish I'd known it at age 13.
See, in your early life, because of this Mars, Sun, Taurus business, I don't care. I'm just going for myself. Get out of my way. Right. Like notches on a belt.
Yeah, you got it.
See, one of the neat things well, not so neat, but one of the things that Libra can do, by the way, sexually, once they learn this secret, then they can create such a degree of dependency on them because of this learned that the partner, you see it? Okay. Becomes another issue.
Walter brought up something that I was thinking, that one of the traps of mutability is its ability to adapt and role play almost. But I think in younger years, people do that because they're not really aware of their own nature. Like Walter said, at 50 years old, I switched, I changed. So can some of the traps of immutability can they be worked through? I guess I already think I know the answer, but it seems like the traps of mutability happen when you're not aware of your own truth, and that's when you're a hypocrite. Mm-hmm. And then as you get older and you gain experience, you learn more about who you are. The inner side of you is Taurus. You discover who you are. So the traps in mutability would lessen with age.
That's true, but see, the way to look at that is, again, the natural triad, Aquarius in this case, Libra. And one of the applications of it is called peer group. We all come through peer groups. And particularly when this is most problematic is when we're in our teenage years. This is when we're most susceptible to peer group pressure. And this now coming through Gemini, Libra. You see my point? So now adopting or adapting into whatever their current social cliches or fads or the grooviest thing is to do. And one of the ways that Aquarius learns is through a process of elimination. I'm not this, I'm not that, therefore what am I? So as time goes on, to what you're describing, for most. Mark?
So I heard you saying, like a Venus in Gemini, there would be some sexual detachment, necessarily so, in order to get the knowledge it needs. But what if that person comes in and they know they have this, but they do want more, they want more engagement? Is there, as a counseling, as a tool to give them, is there a middle road? You know, some way that they can close the gap of the detachment, but still acknowledge that they're in that space? Does that make sense? No, they're really aware that they're detached.
Yeah. To answer your question, it comes back to where they're emanating from, which would mean Taurus. So what you want to talk to them, you would talk to them, try to have their mental part of their consciousness focus specifically on feeling / sensation. Sensation is a Taurus-Scorpio phenomenon relative to being touched. So if you can get that mental component to not so much focus on the imagery via observation, but specifically what they're feeling, this can then help. This stuff making sense to you?
Yeah,
Okay.
we can talk about the hands. Gemini.
What about?
Now don't shoot me now. Traditional astrologers say Gemini, sign of Gemini rules the hands. And in my experience, Gemini deal with dexterity. And crocheting and knitting among Gemini women seems to be very soothing to them. And I think I've discovered that if they like you, they'll find a way to touch you. Reach over and like that. So, and then of course the hands are your major utensils for feeling. So that's what we're talking about. Is that cool?
If you're asking me the questions, are Geminis manually coordinated, sexually speaking, through the hands, the answer is yes.
I learned something.
That's exactly right. Then we connect us back through Libra. You see where that can go. So, you betcha.
And when they have planets in Taurus, who are they touching?
Yeah, right.
I'm glad you didn't say what.
I think it's time to go home. Okay. But it's neat. See, that you're right though about this connection with hands, because when you link it back through Virgo, for example, ruler of Mercury, then this does manifest as massage. And the neat thing when it comes through Gemini is that when Gemini is truly emphasized relative to a person's capacity to do massage via the Uranian connection, it can equal what I would call X-ray hands, in which they just know what's going on and they know what to do naturally. Sagittarian polarity. It's true.
Talcum is better than oil. Oil was cold. Nice.
Well, it's not going to take tourists long to warm up that oil, so.
Where are you standing there, Walter? My car's loose. I'm not going home today. Got an aquarium waiting.
You tell him to do it.
When you look at this in modern history, you will find that relative to the late 60s, that was the young people then, i.e. the late that crowd having Uranus and Gemini. This was the generation that brought back all the sexual ideas. And that's because Gemini, when you look at it from past life view, has direct application into the Eastern world. India.
We also discovered Polaroid cameras and home videos. We also did Polaroid
No, you bet. So, but don't you see the connection? This generation was bored with what their parents' generation was doing, which is primarily the missionary bullshit, just missionary sex. And they got this made restless. So they brought in, migrated of ideas based on their own subconscious memories, i.e. lifetimes in the Eastern world in the past, and therefore forwards.
You're saying this the Eastern world was past life connection. Gemini's.
Connects connects to Laos, it connects to Cambodia, it connects to Nepal, Kashmir. That's why a lot of that generation threw away Western religion and got involved with
Can fuck you up just as much. I say which can do just as much damage.
Sure can. All those are rooted in patriarchy also.
Or at least they admit to reincarnation in past lives, which Christianity doesn't do.
Well, that's not true either. The original Bible had the doctrine of reincarnation.
Yeah.
And it was removed at the Council of Nicene in the 4th century AD.
They changed it.
But there are still elements in the Bible that refer to reincarnation.
Well, Christ does.
Jesus talks about his prior life. He talks about the prior life of John the Baptist and why the roles got reversed. Elisha and Elisha.
Yeah.